I started in this field back in the 1940s. In the 1940s, there was no special education, and we had total inclusion. As a regular classroom teacher, I had all kinds of kids. I guess we put labels on them today. Then we didn't even have the labels, but they were there. Then came the problem of having to include more children in the public schools. We couldn't exclude them. We couldn't send them to institutions. And so the public schools developed a program. But notice what we did. We developed a parallel program. It didn't hurt the public schools. It didn't hurt the regular classroom teacher to say, I can't work with Johnny, send him to special ed. So it was a nice, neat system. For administrators, it was beautiful. All you had to do was get the kid in the right slot, and you were all through. Well, we proved by a lot of research that that didn't work, and there's some personal examples here today who've given testimony to that effect. But look what happens when you change the old system of a parallel system to what we're trying to get now, integration or inclusion. It's not a simple matter of just creating another system, which is relatively simple administratively. It's a systemic change. The whole system has to change. The superintendent, the principals, the Board of Education. And that's what's happened in DeKalb, and it's happened in other communities, and it's happened in segregated, or not segregated, but specific public schools, elementary, middle schools, and high schools. You can find them throughout the state, but it's the individuals there. And I think to get this systemic change, though, we come back to what Senator Berman said. About 30 years ago, one of my colleagues wrote a little article. It was titled, Finance, Without Which There Is No Special Education. And it was true then, and it's true today. And what's happened? The federal government gives us $1 for every 4 they promised. But let's take a look at our own state. What's happened to the personnel reimbursement in this state that was promised to you as a school board member? You went out and you spent the money. And then when you came back and said, now let's have our $8,000, oh, sorry, we've only got $6,200. Where do you get the rest of that money? It comes out of the local taxpayer, which means you rob the rich to pay the poor being, in this case, those students with disability, and as a result, the whole education system has to suffer. And it's wrong, and we've got to develop a sufficient financial base that has equity to it and sufficient funds to do the job right.
Well, Professor, let me just add, and a lot of people wouldn't be upset if, in fact, you were robbing the rich to take care of the poor, but you're not.
Well,
you find yourself either denying the resources to the disabled who need it, or you're taking it from the non-disabled child, the regular education child, and taking money that they are entitled to and putting it elsewhere. We shouldn't be in that kind of a competitive resource. We should have enough funds from a great state like Illinois that has the resources available. We should tap those resources so that the disabled and the non-disabled all get a quality education. We have failed to live up to that commitment.
The point near the end of our time, I'd like to pick up on the last 2 comments, namely, let's talk about funding. Was that on your mind, Alejandro?
No, just a population that's kind of been excluded from this inclusion discussion.
Go ahead.
Now, as we talk about this, one of the things that's very critical is that within special education, right or wrong, we have a lot of minority kids there. Many of them not placed there correctly, particularly African American children and Hispanic children. I believe that school districts didn't know what to do. It was a convenient dumping ground, and I literally mean a dumping ground. If we continue the segregated settings and not ever letting them go in, you have individuals that probably all their academic lives are going to be segregated, not because of a disability, but because somebody didn't really like that particular student. As we talked, one of the things that kind of, and I guess it reflects the organization that I also am aboard, is that kids that don't speak English are in special education, and they're physically included there, but in essence are completely locked out of any effective special education. So I guess I don't want us to forget about populations that are there, but nobody's talking about even appropriately including them into special ed, let alone going one more level over to regular.
One could add, they're not only there, but they're the growing part of our youth. There's another question from the, or comment from the floor.
Senator, I appreciate that you said 20 years ago the same conversation was going on. Whether legislation changes, if you don't address the true barrier, attitudinal, nothing's going to change. And while I'm excited that inclusion, non-inclusion, all this stuff, if we don't look at the needs, as I think Ms. Desjardins said, of the children, we're hurting our community. And the thing that I see that is most critical, whether a child is in a segregated school or the public school, now, not 6 months from now, families have to advocate, get educated how to advocate, and the professionals don't need to stack the room when that one parent goes in to address the needs of their children, because their children turn out to be us. And when we go into university systems, that the true barriers aren't only getting up a curb, but the attitude of the educator to accept and respect us as intelligent and competent individuals is the real obscenity of the situation.
Integration hopefully will help stop attitudinal barriers. I've been in public schools. I once did a survey on a public school that was totally physically accessible. When it opened about 16 years ago, it was touted as the accessible school. I went to that accessible school to do a survey, and not one child in a wheelchair was there. It hit the newspapers. The principal of the school said, "We don't want your people here." And this was 2 years ago. So I think we're all very well aware that attitudinal barriers, do it. But the bottom line is that you've got to sit me next to Sharon for Sharon to, get used to me. She doesn't have to love me. I don't care.
I do, though.
She doesn't have to. But she better respect me, and she better let me live in this world because it's my world, too.
Can we have a comment, ma'am?
Yes. My name is Debbie Escoto, and I'm a bilingual training information specialist with Family Research Center on Disabilities. But some of my concerns here also are on those of a parent. To know that this conversation took place 20 years ago, I find very frightening. I would like to see some very strong outcomes of all the panel, and maybe, as the previous commentator mentioned, parents, family members, and people with disabilities need to have more involvement on various state-level committees and even at national level. I hear a lot of calls in the office that we receive with the same concerns, and as Charlotte mentioned, the basis for inclusion and mainstreaming should be done on an individualized basis, and that applies to all aspects of the child's education, and that is the key word in it, is individualized, and we need to remember that when we review cases, whether it's the MDC and IEP levels, and I just want to make that real short, brief comment about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Certainly, but let me tell the whole panel, and thank you now, and I'll thank you again. We have very few minutes left. This is your last shot. Make it good, but brief.
When we began to not take a look at individual needs of children and say, well, this can be done in this situation and that, first of all, again, the parent has to be the prime advocate for the child. We need to take a look specifically at the needs of that child. We have approximately a 12 to 16% illiteracy rate among blind individuals who cannot read Braille. That's horrendous, because we fail to say, we don't have the teachers in the regular classrooms to teach Braille. Then we're going to have a teacher also learn to sign language. I think there has to be a point, yes, where educationally there are going to be pull-out services, and there are going to be times, and just to pull that child out for that specific reason, and then mainstream them back as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Please, Alejandro again.
I guess I don't agree that the parent has the primary responsibility for advocating for their child. I feel that as a teacher and as an administrator, that's my job. I mean, that's what I'm paid to do. So,
No.
well, okay.
No.
What I said, this is what I said, this is what I believe, this is what I should do, that I should advocate. I'm not going to wait for Mother, Father to come. Secondly, there are many parents that they'd like to advocate, but, they don't speak English, they don't have any accessibility. So if we just strictly leave it to parents, there are some parents that are effectively locked out of the system, and
but we have to help the parents to advocate. That is really the job of all of us here. Us, advocates, teachers, educators, administrators. It's really to help the parents to effectively advocate. We do it. I don't see any reason why educators and administrators can't do it. Now here's somebody who's a parent right now who can tell you some of it about that.
Okay, please, ma'am.
I'm Granada Cartwright, and I also work for the Family Resource Center. I'm also the parent of a child that has severe developmental disabilities. He is mentally disabled, he is physically disabled, and he has severe, significant health impairment. My concern is I think inclusion as a policy is absolutely wonderful. But the reality is that if the dollars are not there to meet the needs that he has, I do not want him in Chicago Public Schools. I don't want him placed in a situation where if there is not a nurse available, she's around the corner, down 3 steps, up 3 flights, he might be dead by the time she gets there. That's a significant concern for me, as for other parents. I agree with you. As a professional, as the teacher, as the administrator, your job is truly to advocate for the child. That does not, however, oversee my responsibilities as the parent. I think what has happened is there's been a systemic thing that's in place that when parents go in, as the gentleman said earlier, the deck is stacked against the parents. Minority parents in particular are afraid of systems. They don't trust systems. They walk in, they see predominantly white, Caucasian people, men, women, it does not matter. They're there, they're afraid. Unless they are able to articulate what their needs are, they shut down. They are not told. They're not given the opportunity to participate in any real way, and I think that's unfair. I think the hiring practices, I think they need to have parents to come in and actually tell them what they need to know to deal with our kids. My son was educated at home for 2 years because he was too ill to go to a school. So we're going to move him from a home situation into this community school with his sister and brother? That's absolutely ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. And no amount of money would make that okay for him.
We have, I'm afraid, come to the end of our time, and everybody wants to speak. Turns out I get the last word. And I can invite every kind of criticism of my attempt to summarize this very, very rich and often contentious discussion. Well, we spent the bulk of our time on inclusion, so it looks like that's the center of gravity in this particular debate. We noted at the outset we're following important laws nationally in 1975, and in 1979 our state joined the rest of the nation in a sense, and it became congruent, but we learned there's a lot of deficits. The prevailing mood about inclusion was to be for it. The wonderful phrase in my mind that segregation is a toxic environment says it all. Nonetheless, the complicated nature of this is reflected by segments of the disabled community, notably people with hearing disability, feeling that culturally and otherwise it's probably important for them to have the option to be with others with disability. And yet the further answer was, what if we taught the teachers to speak in sign language so that they could regain the larger classroom? A lot of points were made about what inclusion is. And I didn't capture them all, but the ones that I did get down, more than one person said, movingly, that attitude is crucial. Attitude at all parties, the person with disability, the parent, the advocate, other advocates for the person, the people who are employed to do the work, the teachers in particular. Any one of these falling down can block the whole process. We heard a lot about the need for resources and accessibility. And the need to prepare the environment, the need that the other students, you can't just do it, you have to have a learning process with the other students, and as I already mentioned, the teacher. The word advocacy repeatedly came out, and it strikes a note with me. I'm absolutely certain that that's crucial. If people are struggling on their own behalf, that's the best environment for change.